Hello again. It's been so good to be with you these last few days on these lessons about praise and worship. We first looked at the difference between praise and worship. Then we talked about the purpose of worship, the preparation for worship, and then prayer in worship. Today I want to kind of go in a different direction. It will still involve worship, but I want to look at a topic of the tragedy of an unaccepted sacrifice. I'm going to be reading in Genesis chapter 4, verses 1 through 7. It says, "And Adam knew Eve his wife, and she conceived and bare Cain, and said, I have gotten a man from the Lord. And she again bare his brother Abel, and Abel was a keeper of sheep, but Cain was a tiller of the ground. And in the process of time it came to pass that Cain brought of the fruit of the ground an offering unto the Lord. And Abel he also brought of the firstlings of his flock, and of the fat thereof, and the Lord had respect unto Abel and to his offering, but unto Cain and to his offering he had no respect. And Cain was very wroth, and his countenance fell. And the Lord said unto Cain, Why art thou wroth, and why is thy countenance fallen? If thou doest well, shall thou not be accepted? And if thou doest not well, sin lieth at the door, and unto thee shall be his desire, and thou shalt rule over him." In this story that we've just read, it's about two brothers who both came together to a place to offer worship unto God. They've both come together to this place with a desire to have fellowship with God. We learn right away from these first two sons of humanity that mankind has an inherent drive, an inner urge to worship God. This should not be surprising to us. After all, we were all made for that purpose. We were made for fellowship with God. We were created for fellowship with Him. We were created to worship Him. We were created for His pleasure, to satisfy a divine desire for companionship. As humbling as it may seem, as incredible of a reality as it really is, God desires the fellowship of His creation. There's also a part of us that hungers for the presence of God. There is an eternal longing within us that can only be satisfied by a relationship with God. There's a timeless part of our being that knows that this is what we were made for, that knows the value of fellowship with God. The heart of man longs to know God. This is what has brought Cain and Abel to this place. They've come to worship God. They've come to offer to God a sacrifice, to establish a connection between them and God. It's not enough that their parents have known God. It's not enough that their parents have fellowship with God. You see, there is an irrepressible desire within them to know God, to experience His blessings, and to walk in fellowship with Him. You see, Cain and Abel offered sacrifices to God in the 4th chapter of the Bible because the favor of God and the blessings of God really mattered to both of them. So finally, the moment comes. Their altars are finished. The sacrifices are ready to be presented to God. Cain, being the oldest, offers his sacrifice first. He places the fruit of the ground upon the altar and he steps back. Together the brothers wait and they watch, but nothing happens. After a space of time, Abel then brings his sacrifice. He places the firstling of his flock on the altar and plunges a knife into it, spilling that precious life-giving blood. Then he too steps back, only this time something happens. The Bible says that God had respect unto Abel and to his offering. The Hebrew word literally means that God looked upon his offering. We don't know exactly what that means, but something happened for Abel that did not happen for Cain. It's very evident that something happened because of Cain's reaction and his anger and then his countenance falling indicates that something happened when Abel offered his sacrifice that had not happened for Cain. It's common in ancient opinion that God consumed Abel's sacrifice with fire from heaven, as he would later do in the Old Testament. But the Bible said Cain had two reactions to his unacceptable sacrifice. First, he became angry. The Hebrew word there for wrath or anger is one that when you get so angry that your nostrils begin to flare like you do when you're angry. Secondly, his countenance fell. This means that he hung his head. It's the universal posture of the defeated, of the broken, of those who have been rejected. He doesn't lift his eyes to the heavens. Instead, he fixes them on the ground. Now, before we can go any further, I want to make a few observations today about Cain. First of all, Cain had a heart to serve God. Cain would not have been in this place on this day building an offering or building an altar and offering a sacrifice if he did not feel a need to worship God. Yes, I believe Cain wanted to worship God. He wanted to serve God. But he wanted to serve God on his own terms. He wanted to be able to establish the context of what it meant to serve God in his life. He wanted to be able to draw some lines and to say, I'm only willing to go this far. This is what I am willing to bring you. It doesn't matter what you want, God. It doesn't matter what you've required. This is what I'm going to bring you. This is all I am willing to do. So the first lesson then that we learn about worship in the Bible is worship is not about us. Worship is not about what we want or what we need or what we desire. Worship has nothing to do with how we define it. Worship is about God. You see, we don't get to choose the measure of what is pleasing to God. We don't get to choose what God will accept. We don't get to come to God on our own terms. God defines worship. God chooses what is acceptable to Him. God determines the parameters by which we can approach Him. And He alone decides what He blesses and what He curses. He alone decides what He accepts and what He rejects. So the first lesson we learn about worship is it's not about us. The second lesson we learn about worship is, in the Bible, is that worship is a window into the condition of the heart. When a worshiper offers a sacrifice to God, the worshiper quite literally puts his heart on display in his sacrifice. He demonstrates the condition of his heart in how he worships God. You see, Cain's offering reflected a heart that wanted the blessings of God, but was not willing to pay fully the price that God desired. It was demonstrative of a heart that wanted to know God only as long as it did not cost him too much. Abel brought the firstling of his flock and the fat thereof, the Bible says. That means he separated out the best that he had, the firstlings of his flock. Then he went through those and he selected the fattest among them. And when he brought his offering, Abel brought the best of the best. Cain, on the other hand, selected the fruit of the ground. Never mind the fact that it's not a blood offering. We'll set that aside for this lesson today, even though that also was a problem. But Cain, who was a farmer, brought God an offering of the fruit of the ground. Notice that it doesn't say he brought the first fruit. It doesn't say that he brought the best fruit or the largest fruit. It doesn't even say that he brought the ripest fruit. Just that he brought the fruit of the ground. In other words, Cain gave God a portion of his produce. Not necessarily the worst portion, but certainly not his best either. It was just a good representation of the fruits of his labor. In other words, Cain assigned a value to the fellowship of God, and he valued it somewhere less than his very best. What amazes me is that Cain chooses to worship God. Cain chooses to seek out the fellowship of God. Cain goes to the trouble of building an altar unto God. But then Cain offers God something less than his best. We know this is important to Cain. We know that the emotional aftermath will result in the murder of his brother. So Cain is really deeply invested in the need to be accepted by God. But he doesn't have enough respect for God to bring his very best. Somehow Cain has decided to offer God a sacrifice, but he thinks that he can hold back his best from God. This is what amazes me. He's going to go to the trouble to build an altar and to offer God an offering, but he's not willing to put his best on the altar. His offering is a window to his heart. And it clearly demonstrates that even though he was making an offering to God, his heart was far from genuine worship. So I want you to stop for a minute today and ask yourself a question. What does your worship say about you? What does your sacrifice say about your heart? Are you serving God out of obligation? Are you making a token offering on the altar of the Lord? Are you just doing as little as you have to get by? Are you just going through the motions? I'm asking you to examine your sacrifice. I told you this lesson today would be different than the first four, and I am not here to assume anyone's position with God or in their worship. But I want to encourage each one of us today to give our very best to God. Because desire alone is not what makes a sacrifice acceptable. Showing up or even building an altar and even placing an offering on the altar, none of that caused God to look on Cain with favor. You see, Cain went to great efforts to worship God, only to walk away disappointed, because Cain sought to worship God on his own terms, because he thought he could give God something less than his very best. I believe there's a lesson to be learned here. When you insist on bringing God an unacceptable sacrifice, when you insist on bringing God something less than your best, you open the door for the bondage of sin in your life. The prelude to being separated from God is an unacceptable sacrifice on the altar of your life. Yes, we may get away with it for a little while. We may convince ourselves that a half-hearted effort is all God requires of us. But make no mistake about it, you're opening the door of your heart to the destroyer of your soul. Let me go back and reread verses 6 and 7 from Genesis 4. It said, "The Lord said to Cain, Why art thou wroth, and why is thy countenance fallen?" This is after the unacceptable sacrifice was offered. But then God goes on to say, "If you do well, shall you not be accepted?" In other words, God said, I'm giving you another opportunity. You can offer an acceptable sacrifice. If you so choose, if you do well, I will accept it. But if you don't do well, sin lieth at the door. Unfortunately, Cain did not take this opportunity to evaluate his offering. He did not take this time to offer an acceptable sacrifice. He assumed that because God did not accept his first sacrifice, that was his only chance. But friend, God is a God of mercy and grace. God is the God of second chances, and he gave Cain a second chance. Sin had not even entered into Cain. It was just lying at the door waiting to see what Cain would do. Cain was not separated from God until sin got its claws in him. He was not driven out and banished to a far country until sin had run its course in his life. Before that happened, God warned him. Before that happened, God reached to Cain with mercy and grace. And today, God reaches to each one of us in that same manner. The quickest route to sin is a half-hearted devotion to God. You see, the heart backslides first. The heart drifts away from God long before sin cuts you off from God. Your first love grows cold, and your passion for the things of God fades. You see, when praise and worship and sacrifice becomes a burden, when serving God becomes an inconvenience, that's when we are walking on dangerous ground. When you find yourself just going through the motions, when you no longer find any pleasure in the things you do for God, those are indicators that you're giving God something less than your best, and that's a dangerous place to be. You see, with Cain, what started out so well ended in such a tragedy. I believe Cain truly desired to worship God. I believe Cain really did want to know God, but he was like the rich young ruler. The cost was just too much. The sacrifice required of him was too great. So he offered God an unacceptable sacrifice, and ultimately he lost it all. In closing out these lessons on worship and praise, let me just encourage each one of you today to always give God your best. Find time in every day for prayer and for praise and for worship. When you gather together in your worship services, give God your very best. When you're working for Him on your job and in your neighborhood and in the marketplace, be the best witness you can be for God, because all of life is worship unto God. And we want to give God an acceptable sacrifice so that He will look upon us and He will accept us and will receive our worship unto Him. God bless you, and I hope that you've been blessed by our time together.